Chapter 8. Breakfast. It was, predictably, an extremely irritable and very stiff and sore Elizabeth Cardwell whom I freed at the 8th Korean hour, at which time I returned to my compartment. She was, of course, precisely where I had left her, though she had managed to lie on her side on the stones and get 1 or 2 hours' sleep that night. It didn't seem desirable, I informed her, tongue-in-cheek, that I show you particular solicitude in the presence of Ho Tu, Master Keeper. I suppose not, she grumbled, slipping her slave livery over her shoulders, tying the slip-knot on the left shoulder, and then grimacing, rubbing her wrists and ankles. In the future, she said, I recommend, when it becomes necessary to impress someone, you simply strike me a few times with the slave whip. Well, that's a thought, I admitted. She looked at me grimly. My knots are a great deal neater than yours, she said. I laughed and swept her into my arms. You wench, I cried. It's true, she said irritably, struggling. I kissed her. Yes, I said, it is true. Your knots are indeed a great deal neater than mine. She looked up at me and smiled, somewhat mollified. But, she suddenly said irritably, that finger-snapping business was not necessary. Eat from your hand, indeed. Well, I thought it a real coup, I said. It certainly seemed to impress Ho Tu. It did, didn't it? Said Elizabeth. Yes, I said decisively. And you try it when we are alone, said Elizabeth, and I will bite your hand off. Ugh! I cried, and Elizabeth jumped. It seems you must spend another night bound in the slave ring, I announced. Don't you dare, she cried. I seized her wrist, and she kicked at me, catching me rather a good one under the knee. I stepped behind her and held her. She squirmed furiously, kicking back, trying to hit me with her small fists. I was laughing. My knee, incidentally, also hurt. Do not struggle, slave, I told her. She stopped struggling, but was fuming. I began to nibble at the loop on the left shoulder of her slave livery. Do you know what time it is? She asked. No, I admitted. If you'd listened to the bars, she said, you'd know. What time is it? I said. It is past the 8th bar, she informed me. Well, so, I said. So, I have not had anything to eat since yesterday morning, and if I am not at the trough in the quarters for the female slaves by the small bar after the 8th, I will miss breakfast. I simply cannot go down to the kitchen like you and demand 5 Vulu eggs. I laughed. But it was my intention to discipline you, I said. She squared off against me, hitching up the loop on her shoulder, which I had loosened with my teeth. My discipline, she said, can wait until after breakfast. I think you are simply punishing me, I told her. She laughed. After breakfast, she said, blowing me a kiss, much as I had her the earlier evening before. You can discipline me then. And she turned and scurried down the corridor. I kicked the love furs halfway across the room and sat down on the edge of the stone couch. It was a chipper-fed Elizabeth Cardwell who returned to the compartment, humming and sprightly. Did you enjoy your wait? She asked. It seems to me, I said, you lingered long over your breakfast. The porridge in the trough this morning was simply marvellous, she said. I closed the door and set the beams in place. Now, she said, it looks like I'm in trouble. You certainly are, I agreed. I inquired, but I could not learn exactly when my training is to begin. Ah, I said. There will apparently be other girls too, she said. Probably, I said. It would be a waste of time, I imagine, to train girls one at a time. I did not mention the girls I had seen the night before. I suppose, since they would not speak Korean, they would be not used in the training. Earth girls I knew were usually sold as untrained barbarians at inferior prices. On the other hand, it was certainly not impossible that the girls brought in the other night, or some of them, would be trained with Elizabeth, probably being taught Korean in the process. The fact that Elizabeth's training was not beginning immediately gave some suggestion that this might be the case. "Tonight," said Elizabeth, "after the 16th bar, I am to report to the smith in the iron pens." "It seems," I said, "the little Tuchuk slave girl will again wear her nose ring." "Did you like it?" asked Elizabeth. "Very much," I admitted. "I grew rather fond of it too," said Elizabeth, "after a time." This time I said it will probably not hurt as much to affix the ring. "No," she said, "I don't think so." And she knelt down in the room as naturally and easily as a Korean girl. "What did you learn," she asked, "of the house of Kernus last night?" "I'll tell you," I said, coming close to her and sitting down cross-legged. "I myself," she said pointedly, "learnt very little." She looked at me. "I was all tied up, so to speak," she said. "So to speak," I admitted. "But I learned enough for both of us." I then, in great detail, told Elizabeth all I had seen and learned the night before. She was generally intrigued, though frightened when I spoke of the thing called the Beast, and distressed when I mentioned the girls brought from Earth to be sold as slaves from the house of Kernus. "What is our next step?" she asked. "It is to learn more of the house of Kernus," I said. "Do you know much of the house?" "I know certain areas quite well," she said. "Further, I can receive a pass tile from Capris to go most places in the house." "But there are certain places that are forbidden?" "Yes," she said. "I expect I should undertake a bit of exploring." "First," she said, "learn what areas of the house are open. I would suppose you could go in many places I could not. On the other hand, I would have access to records that you would not in the office of Capris. Who, too, I'm sure, would be pleased to guide you. That way you would be familiarized with the house, and would also indirectly have the forbidden areas clearly marked out for you." I thought about that. "Yes," I said, "that's a good plan. It is simple, natural, deceptive, and likely of success." "With a good breakfast," said Elizabeth, "I'm a pretty shrewd wench." "That is true," I admitted. "You are not bad before breakfast either." "Oh, but after breakfast," she said, "I am extraordinary." "It is now after breakfast," I informed her. "Well," she said, smiling, "I think you will find that after breakfast I am extraordinary." She leant closer to me, smiling, putting one finger up to my shoulder. "But I have not yet had breakfast," I said. "Oh," she said. "Show me where the important people eat," I said. "All you ever think about is food," she said. "That is not all I ever think about," I said. "That's true," she said. Elizabeth led me to a room off a kitchen on the 3rd floor of the cylinder. There were some men in the room, mostly men-at-arms, but some staff members, a metal worker, 2 bakers, and a pair of scribes. The tables were separate and small, and I sat behind one, and Elizabeth knelt back of me and to my left. She lifted her head, sniffing. I did too, scarcely believing my nose. She looked at me, and I looked at her. A girl slave in white tunic and white collar, barefoot, came to the table and knelt before it. "What is that I smell?" I asked. "Black wine," she said, "from the mountains of Thentis." I heard of black wine, but I'd never had any. It is drunk in Thentis, but I had never heard of it being much drunk in any of the other cities. "Bring 2 bowls," I said. "2?" asked the girl. "The slave," I said, indicating Elizabeth, "will taste it first." "Of course, master," said the girl. and put bread over the fire, and honey, and the eggs of Vulus, and fried task meat, and a Taurian llama fruit. The girl nodded, and, rising gracefully, backed away a step or two, head down, turned and went to the kitchen. "I have heard," I said to Elizabeth, "that black wine is served hot." "Incredible," she smiled. In short order, 2 bowls, steaming, coming out of them, was brought and placed on the table. I sat there staring down at them, and Elizabeth did too, and then I picked up one of the thick, heavy clay bowls. Since no one was looking, we knocked the bowls together and put them to our lips. It was extremely strong and bitter, but it was hot, and unmistakably it was coffee. I shared the breakfast with Elizabeth, who informed me that it was better than the porridge below in the trough, in the feeding rooms for female slaves, marvellous though the latter might have been. "I envy you free ones," said Elizabeth. "Next time you be the slave, and let me be the assassin." "Actually," I said to Elizabeth, "this is very rare. Thentis does not trade the beans for black wine. I have heard of a cup of black wine in R some years ago selling for a silver 80 piece. Even in Thentis black wine is not used commonly except in the high caste homes." "Perhaps it's from Earth?" she asked. "Oh, originally doubtless beans were brought from Earth," I said, "much as certain other seeds and silkworms and such. But I doubt very much that the ship I saw last night had in its cargo anything as trivial as the beans for black wine." "You're probably right," said Elizabeth, taking another sip, her eyes closed. I was troubled for a moment, but it passed. Recalling that the warrior who had been slain, presumably in my stead, on the bridge in the vicinity of the cylinder of warriors in Coryba, had been of Thentis. "It is very good," said Elizabeth. Breakfast finished, we returned to the compartment, where I untied my signature knot, with which I had closed the door. We entered, and I closed the door, put the beans in place, and took off my sword-belt. Elizabeth had gathered up the love furs which I had kicked across the room, and had spread them at the foot of the couch. Now, as though suddenly weary, she reclined on them, looked at me, and yawned. "What do you have to report to Capris? And when?" I asked. "Oh, he is one of us," she said. "He works for the priest-kings, so he holds me to no close schedule, and lets me leave the house when I wish. Yet I suppose I should report upon occasion." "Are there other assistants to him?" I asked. "He manages several scribes," she said, "but they do not work closely with him. There are some other girls as well, but Capris is permissive, and we come and go pretty much as we please." She looked up at me. "If I do not report too regularly, all will assume I have been detained," she said. "I see." "You have been up all night," she said. "You must be tired." "Yes," I said, reclining on the love furs. "Poor master," she said, poking me in the neck with one finger. I rolled over and seized her in my arms, but she turned her head away and seemed determined I should not kiss her. She laughed. "Whose nuts were neater?" she asked. "Yours, yours, yours," I mumbled, "yours," in frustration. "Very well, you may kiss me." I did so, grumbling as she laughed. An hour later, however, I had my vengeance. "Will you eat out of my hand?" I inquired. "Yes, yes," she cried. "Even when we are alone?" I inquired. "Yes," she cried, "yes." "Beg," I told her. "Vella begs to eat from master's hand," she cried. "Vella begs to eat from master's hand." I laughed. "You big beast," she laughed, and we kissed one another much. "You have always been able to make me eat out of your hand, Jarl Gabbett," she said. "You big beast." And I kissed her again. "But my nuts are still neater." "That is true," I admitted. She laughed. "There's nothing like coffee and a good wench after breakfast," I told her. "I told you," she said, "after breakfast I am extraordinary." "You were right," I said. "You were right." After we had kissed, I rolled over and fell asleep. But Elizabeth busied herself about the compartment, afterwards leaving to go to the office of Capris, perhaps about the 12th hour. She would tie her signature knot on the outside of the door. On the inside we had cut the loop, and with a simple knot tied the two cords together, so that when we wished we might let ourselves out of the compartment without cutting the cord on the inside. I slept long, and she came and went in the compartment more than once, I think. At last, about the 17th hour, she returned, set the beams in place, and lay down beside me, putting her head on my shoulder. I saw that she now wore in her nose the tiny, fine golden ring of the Tuchuk women.